Hello, and welcome to the second part of our lecture on World War II. Today, we will examine the events of the war from 1942 to 1945. Alright, first let's do a little recapping. From 1939 to 1942, the Axis powers dominated Europe, North Africa, and Asia. So if you look at all of the colors on the map here, the orange are all of the Axis powers, and the purple will be all of the Allied powers. So you can see the world is pretty divided in World War II thus far in the war. The fighting was mostly the German style of blitzkrieg tactics, and they used this pretty successfully to dominate the eastern and western parts of Europe. If you remember the Blitz, this is where they will attack really hard, really fast in a centralized location, and then they will retreat before their opponents can really mount any sort of resistance to them. England will be very wounded from these German attacks during the Battle of Britain, where the Germans, for several months, are going to bombard British cities. But they are going to be able to persevere. And as we see, Hitler will grow even bolder as he breaks the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact that he had with the Soviet Union, and he will march his troops into Russia. So now Hitler has opened himself up to a two-front war, very similar to the one that Germany had during World War I. So as World War II progresses, the German and Italian armies are going to dominate the areas of northern Africa, and they will threaten the Suez Canal and a lot of the oil fields in the Middle East, which is going to be where Britain and these allied countries are getting a lot of their oils and resources. So this is a very strategic move on their part. So remember, while all of this is going on, there are two different stages of the war that it's being played out on. So you've got the war in Europe and the war in the Pacific. So the Japanese are dominating Asia. They're crippling the US Navy at Pearl Harbor, and it takes a while to rebuild. And the United States kind of decides early on that they would focus their efforts primarily on Europe at first, and then after they settle the score in Europe, they will go back to the Pacific. So while Europe is busy with this war and the United States sends their attentions there, Japan is going to focus a lot more on the Pacific. They're going to take all of these Western colonies in the Pacific that the Europeans really just can't protect anymore. So mostly French and British colonies, and some US. So taking these countries is what they're going to do while Europe is too busy to stop them. However, the Allied powers will begin to turn the tide of the war in 1942 and will eventually defeat the Axis powers by 1945. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that the United States joined the war, which brings a lot of their resources with them, and it really changes the dynamics. So when the United States does enter World War II, they are now going to be allies with Britain and the Soviet Union. So Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, he wants the Allies to open a Western front and divide up Germany, because right now there really isn't a Western front, because the Germans have already captured France. But instead of doing that, Britain and the United States agree that it's more important to get the Axis powers out of North Africa, and instead try to start closing them in so they can start cutting off resources, which is one of the ways that they had previously won World War I, just a few decades earlier. So this really angers Stalin, because that means that most of the fighting is still going to be happening in Eastern Europe, where he is the only person doing all of the brunt fighting against the Germans. So he's really feeling the heat from his own people for this. And he's just tired of having these allies he feels like aren't really going to do anything for him. But anyways, the Allies will be successful in their North African campaign, and they are going to successfully defeat the Germans in the Battle of El Alamein in 1942. And they're able to push the Axis powers completely out of Africa. So this is a very successful event for them. And they even are able to move into Italy because of this drive. They are going to take over Sicily in 1943, and then by 1944, they will actually be able to overtake Rome. And in 1945, you see that Hitler's really close ally Mussolini is going to be captured and executed by members of the Italian resistance. The Italian resistance was always present in Italy underground, and they were really emboldened by the United States and the British arriving and kind of being so close to Rome when they captured it. So that's when they get their opportunity to get Mussolini. which I think is a fitting end for him, dying by the hands of his own people rather than foreigners. So now Hitler is really left without any of his major allies, or his biggest ally, Italy. So while this is all going on, where the United States and Britain are pushing in towards Italy, the Soviet Union is having to keep fighting in their own country. And the Soviet army stops a very important attack at Moscow and Leningrad in 1942. But as you can see from the picture here, the Soviet Union is getting very concerned. The Germans are actually getting very far into the Soviet Union, which is why Stalin is so adamant that a Western front needs to be created. One major turning point for the Soviet Union is going to be at the Battle of Stalingrad. Don't you just love it when leaders name cities after themselves? You know, it's so modest. So anyways, this big victory at Stalingrad comes. It's a major turning point for World War II because after this point, the Soviets are able to start pushing the Germans out of the Soviet Union and start pushing them back into Germany. And this will all happen right around the same time the United States and Britain will launch their Western Front attack. So in 1943, the leaders of the Allies are going to come together for a face-to-face meeting. So this will be Joseph Stalin over there on the left, in the middle is Franklin Roosevelt, and then on the right is Winston Churchill. They're going to meet in Tehran to coordinate a plan to defeat Germany. This is actually the first time all of these influential men have ever been in the same room together. So just think about kind of how amazing that would be. They're actually going to be called the Big Three as their nickname. So it's during this conference the Big Three agree to divide the German army and decide where their Western Front is going to be. By 1944, the Allies decided to open up their Western Front, and they will invade Nazi-occupied France. This operation is called Operation Overlord, which is also more commonly called D-Day. In June of 1944, D-Day will be the largest land and sea attack in modern history. And if you look here on the map, you can kind of see what it looks like. But I mean, the sheer numbers of this is just astonishing. They were able to get a surprise on the Germans because of where they came in. So Normandy isn't actually the closest point to the United Kingdom, and that's really where the Nazis thought they would come, was from the closest point. And you can see that Normandy is a little bit less fortified than other areas, that they expected the British to come from sooner. So just to give you some numbers of the sheer enormity of this event, there's an estimated 6,000 naval vessels that will carry over 132,000 soldiers across these rough seas, not even mentioning the 13,000 planes that took part in this attack, or 23,000 paratroopers that will propel from the planes. So you can just imagine the sheer size that this operation took to perform. And this is what really allows the Allies to get into France and start taking back land from the Nazis. So the Allies are going to start pushing Germany more east. At the same time, the Soviet Union is going to be pushing them towards the west. So now they're starting to close in on Germany. And you can see they get all of France back, and then Hitler is forced to fight his two-French war, which is what he really didn't want to do in the first place. Hitler's response to this is that he tries to mount this huge counterattack at the Battle of the Bulge, but he's not going to be successful. And by March of 1945, the Allies were fighting in Germany itself and start pushing toward its capital, Berlin.
So, now we're in February 1945, and the Big Three are all going to meet again at the Yalta Conference, and they are going to start creating a plan for what Europe will be like after the war is over. Some of the things that they decided during this agreement was that Stalin would send troops to help the United States invade Japan, because remember, they're still a little bit bitter about Japan taking over Manchuria back in the early part of the 1900s. Also, all of these world leaders will agree that they are going to allow self-determination of all of these new countries, which basically means free elections, and they're going to let these countries decide what type of government they want. Do they want to be a democracy, or do they want to have a monarchy? Whatever it is, they're not going to interfere. And so this is going to be very important, especially when we talk about the Cold War coming up, because what you'll see is that this basically does not happen. Another big compromise they come up with is that they agree that all of these nations are going to occupy Germany after the war. So by nations, I mean Britain, the US, and the Soviet Union. So they're going to all take over different parts of Germany to help make sure things are running okay. They figured out that's one thing we didn't do very well after World War I. So we're going to make sure somebody keeps an eye on Germany this time. So they're all going to take different parts of Germany to help monitor and agree to create, they also will agree to create a United Nations, which is going to be like the improved 2.0 version of the League of Nations. And this time, the United States will be a part of it. As the Allies start pushing into Germany and Poland, troops will start discovering and liberating concentration and death camps. And this is something that the United States and Britain, they really didn't know the extent to which these places were extermination camps. They knew that the Jews had been sent here and that they were work camps, but they didn't know the type of death and destruction these camps were meant to cause. So it was a real shock to them as they start to uncover a lot of these atrocities. After the war is over, they will try to hold people accountable for their actions in these concentration camps. You see that they do hold war tribunes, where they attempt to punish the real leaders of the Jewish extermination movement. And of course, they don't get all of the major people, but they actually are able to bring a good amount to justice. So, by April of 1945, the Soviet Army will capture Berlin, and on April 30th, 1945, Hitler will officially commit suicide. And just a few days later, on May 9th, the German government will sign an unconditional surrender to the Allies. And this day is celebrated throughout the world as VE Day, or Victory in Europe. So the war is not officially over, it's just over in Europe, but it's still a big deal.
So, while the war is coming to an end in Europe, the Allies still have to fight the Japanese in the Pacific. After the attack at Pearl Harbor, the United States will send troops to the Pacific Theater to start trying to get control of Japan. But their primary focus will be in Europe until the end of the war in Europe. New technology during this time will be a big impact on the United States as they have to adjust to these new Japanese tactics. So now we have this new technology of aircraft carriers. And aircraft carriers, of course, are super large ships that have planes on them. So now we have this new advantage of being able to use planes to fight on these land and sea battles out here in the Pacific. And a big turning point in the war is going to come from the Battle of Midway. Midway was one of these islands that the Japanese had taken over. And it's after this victory that the United States and the Allies really start to regain control of these islands controlled by Japan, because Japan had pretty much had free reign over all of these islands and territories while Europe was at war. One thing that the Allies are going to figure out very early on is that Japan uses untraditional styles of war tactics. So usually when you're in a war, or at least the way the Allies had always operated, was that there are set standards that you abide by. For example, like if you capture prisoners, you would want to keep them in a prisoner of war camp, and you would want to make sure they were treated with some sort of respect, because you want to make sure that your soldiers are receiving the same kind of treatment in their POW camps. But what you see is that the Japanese are not going to abide by these rules. Like you can see on the picture on the right, prisoner of war camps were often very brutal, and thousands of US soldiers will lose their lives in these camps. The Japanese also had the mindset that one was never to surrender, and you were supposed to fight to the death, because that was the noble and honorable thing to do, would be to die rather than come home and bring that shame to your families. And I mean, that's one of the reasons why the POW camps are kind of as bad as they are, is the Japanese did not have the expectation that they would have any prisoners of war that were Japanese. They thought that their soldiers were going to go die before they would ever become prisoners. And I mean, in most cases, that's pretty true. And that's also where we get the term kamikaze. So, of course, the kamikaze pilots were the ones that would fly their planes into targets and ultimately kill themselves, which is something that the Allies really weren't ready for, too. When we talked about the word kamikaze earlier in this class, we talked about how it meant like the winds of the gods. So it kind of makes sense that they use this to talk about the pilots in Japan. But their intent is to carry out their duty to their death. So as we can see, the Allies really had a learning curve here trying to get used to Japanese tactics. But the Allies at this time are going to start recapturing islands, but they're going to have to change their tactic. It's taking them too much time to try and take over each of these islands individually. The Japanese had conquered thousands of small islands around the Pacific, and the amount of time it would take to recapture each individual island is just too time-consuming. For example, the fight for the Guadalcanal took 6 months and cost 25,000 Japanese lives and 2,000 US soldiers' lives, just for that one island. So imagine trying to take back thousands of islands, and you really just can't. So the United States will develop the strategy of island hopping to combat this problem. So what they do is they identify which islands are heavily fortified, and then they skip those, and they go to all the islands that are not as fortified. So they're able to conquer those more defenseless islands, and then they kind of are able to surround those larger fortified islands, which makes it a lot easier for them to take over later. So from 1943 to 1945, the Allies will take back the Philippines, and they start moving closer and closer to Japan by taking over these smaller islands. In 1945, the Allies will win the very important islands of Iwo Jima and Okinawa that are actually very close to the Japanese mainland. And they finally get close enough that they can start firebombing Japanese cities. So their planes, they can reach the mainland with bombs, and it's important to remember that they needed aircraft carriers up until that time because their planes couldn't hold that much weight, the weight of the bombs and of the oil, to be able to get them to and from those locations. So now they are really actually able to make an attack on Japan itself. And you have to understand that firebombing estimate of Tokyo and some of the surrounding areas are just astounding once they actually start firebombing these areas. It's estimated in Tokyo alone that close to 150,000 people were killed from firebombs that the US dropped, which is actually going to be more of an impact than that of the nuclear bombs dropped in Hiroshima or Nagasaki. But I would argue that the after effects of both of those bombs will increase the death amount substantially. This graphic right here is just showing you the initial impact of killing of the bombs. So the United States is really kind of devastating major Japanese cities with this firebombing. So despite the fact that the Japanese are starting to lose control of the Pacific, and it brought all of these firebomb attacks coming down on them, Japan refuses to surrender, and by May 1945, the war in Europe is over, and the US begins preparing for a full land invasion of Japan, which is something they really didn't want to do because they're so unfamiliar with the territory. A land invasion is also very costly and very dangerous, and if you don't have to do it, you don't want to do it. But that may not be necessary. In 1939, the famous scientist Albert Einstein wrote to US President Franklin Roosevelt about the potential to build the first nuclear bomb. FDR created a top-secret program called the Manhattan Project to help establish and create this new kind of technology. He gathers scientists from all over the country to build this bomb, and they're primarily going to operate out of the desert in New Mexico. This is so top secret, he really doesn't tell anyone in the rest of his cabinet or his vice president that this all is happening. And then, in April of 1945, FDR loses his battle with polio, and he officially dies while in office, so his vice president, Harry Truman, is left to decide how to end the war in the Pacific. And I've read statements that have said that Truman had no idea what was going on with this nuclear bomb. So when he gets his first debriefing as president, they tell him that this is available, and he realizes the enormous responsibility that is now placed on him. In July of 1945, the Big Three will meet again, but now there's a new face, as Truman is now part of the Big Three, and they will meet in Potsdam, which is right outside of Berlin, to discuss the end of World War II and all of the terms and conditions that will go into the Treaty of the War. It is at this conference that Truman learns the first atomic bomb was ready to use, and it is there that he issues the ultimatum to Japan, telling them to surrender or face total destruction. Which, of course, the Japanese don't know they have this kind of technology. They think it's just another tactic, and that they're going to engage in a more physical sort of war. So, of course, they disregard this whole thing. Another interesting thing to note is that neither of the US's allies, the Soviet Union or Great Britain, knew about this bomb either. So Stalin, especially when he learns that the US had this in their arsenal, becomes very competitive. He's very angry that he was not made privy to this information, especially since they're supposed to be allies at this time. So he immediately starts his own teams to research how to produce this type of weapon. So when Japan refuses to surrender, Truman orders the bombing of Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. After 3 days, Japan still does not surrender, so the second atomic bomb was dropped on the city of Nagasaki. And it's after the second atomic bomb that Emperor Hirohito agrees to officially surrender. So fun fact for all of you GHS students, the US navalman standing there in the picture with the treaty for Emperor Hirohito to sign is actually Admiral Nimitz from Fredericksburg, Texas. So if you ever get to go to Fredericksburg, you can visit the Nimitz Museum. He was the highest ranking officer in the Pacific at the time, so he was the one that was sent to manage the peace treaty. So just fun fact for you. So yay, now World War II is officially over, and the world is at peace once again, and we will never ever have a great conflict ever again, right? So let's talk about some overall impacts of World War II, the largest, most deadly, most impactful war in all of human history, at least so far. So Europe is completely destroyed by the war, and they're going to lose their place as the epicenter of power in the world. So think about that for a minute. For the last close to 300 years now, Europe has really been the center of world power. But this fighting of back-to-back wars totally devastates their city and their economies, leaving them to rebuild from literal rubble. It is now that the US and the Soviet Union will emerge as the major superpowers of the world, and they will start competing with each other for global dominance. Historians usually estimate that the Cold War starts the day the peace treaty was signed in Europe, and it starts a whole new era of global relations. The United Nations will also be formed during this time to replace the League of Nations, and their goal really is to promote world peace and keep people from going to war with each other, so that if conflict can be settled diplomatically, there's no need to involve ourselves in war. And this time, they will open it up to the Axis powers to be included in this organization. Currently today, there's only, I think, 3 different territories or countries not currently in the United Nations. You also see this huge movement of decolonization, as these European colonies, now places like India and all the colonies in Africa and Asia, they're going to start to demand their independence from Europe. And the Europeans will basically have to give it to them because they really can't afford to keep them. They can't afford to start another war. So now you've got all these newly developed nations that people have to figure out what they're going to do. How are they going to structure their government systems, their economies? What kind of rights are they going to give to their people? So there's a lot of new opportunity for growth and a lot of competition over who is going to align with these new countries. You also see a lot of new trade patterns start happening as well. Okay, you finally made it to the end. Thanks for watching, and next time we'll start looking into the Cold War.